There are cities where people walk past suffering as if it were part of the pavement, where broken souls become invisible long before their bodies give up. And in the midst of that cold indifference moved a young homeless girl named Zuri, so gentle, so quietly brave, that destiny itself paused to watch her. What she did not know was that her kindness, buried beneath dust and hunger, was about to collide with a life far different from her own, setting off a chain of events powerful enough to shake the whole city. For months, Zuri had survived beneath a broken bus shelter that rattled in the wind and leaked when the rains came. She curled up at night with only a piece of cardboard between her and the cold ground, wrapping her arms around herself to hold in whatever warmth her thin body could manage. Even in the harshest moments, she carried a grace that felt out of place in a city overflowing with wealth. She woke each morning with a silent determination, smoothing her ragged skirt, tying back her hair with trembling fingers, and whispering a prayer her late mother used to say, one asking for strength rather than rescue. Her days unfolded in small acts of survival. She cleaned windshields at red lights, not with desperation, but with a shy politeness that caught people off guard. She collected leftover food from restaurants closing late at night. She carried a stolen dignity that refused to allow her to beg loudly or create scenes. She lived on scraps the world discarded, yet held on to a goodness that hunger hadn't managed to steal. When someone tossed her a coin, she whispered a thank you so soft it was often swallowed by engine noise. Despite the cruelty of her circumstances, Zuri never hardened. Her heart remained tender in ways that felt almost unbelievable. She would give half of her bread to a stray dog whose ribs showed through its fur. She watched families through restaurant windows, remembering her own, her mother's warm hands, her father's booming laugh, the evenings filled with stories and gentle scoldings. Those memories were painful, yet they were the only anchor she had left in a world that pushed her aside. At night, beneath the flickering street lamp that barely lit the cracked sidewalk, she often wondered how a child became invisible. She saw people glance at her with discomfort, guilt, or cold disinterest, and she learned to shrink herself so their eyes wouldn't linger. But she never allowed bitterness to bloom inside her. Instead, she whispered her parents' names into the dark, reminding herself that she came from love, even if the world forgot that truth. Her silence was not emptiness, it was restraint. Her loneliness was not weakness, it was survival. And every time she lifted her tired body from the ground in the morning, she carried the same fragile hope, that tomorrow might be kinder than today, and that somewhere, someone might see her, not as a burden, but as a human being. Yet life rarely reveals its turning points in advance. Destiny often watches from the shadows, waiting for the smallest moment to shift everything. And Zuri had no idea that one such moment was creeping toward her, stepping closer with every breath she took beneath that broken bus shelter. Because the next morning, just as the sun began lifting its pale glow over the city, Zuri's quiet path would cross with someone whose body could not move, and whose spirit was fading fast. A boy whose silent suffering would pull her into a story far greater than hunger or survival. And nothing in her life would ever be the same again. There are children whose suffering makes noise, whose tears demand attention, but there are others whose pain becomes so silent, so hidden, that the world forgets they are breaking. And somewhere beyond the reach of pity, inside a luxury car gliding through a city of glitter and blindness, lived a young boy whose silence was heavier than any hunger Zuri had ever known. She did not yet realize that one glance into those wounded eyes would unravel a destiny woven far beyond her understanding. Tundek had once been the golden thread in his father's life, a bright African child whose laughter could fill even the grandest rooms of the Kamau mansion with warmth. But the accident that stole the movement from his legs had done something far crueler to him. It had stolen his voice, his courage, and every spark of joy that once defined him. Where there had once been sunshine, there was now a cold, unreachable stillness. His body survived each day, but his spirit barely crossed the threshold of living. Mr. Kamau, his billionaire father, had combed through nations chasing doctors, treatments, machines that hummed promises, and therapies wrapped in hopeful words. But no amount of money reached the space where Tunda had hidden himself. The boy grew quieter, smaller, retreating into a world so dim that even light seemed unable to enter. His eyes became a mirror of deep loneliness, a loneliness untouched by luxury, untouched by comfort, untouched by the father who would have traded every coin he possessed just for a single smile. For safety, Tunda was kept in the redesigned back seat of their luxury car, a traveling room filled with medical equipment, sterile wipes, padded cushions, and the remnants of a childhood frozen by trauma. Therapists came and went, adjusting his limbs gently, whispering encouragement that never reached the center of his silence. The world outside moved quickly, loudly, thoughtlessly, yet inside that vehicle time seemed to slow and settle into shadows. It was during one such routine stop, when the therapist stepped out to purchase calming oils from a nearby shop, that Zuri noticed him. She had been washing a windshield, her hands numb from morning cold, when the faintest movement inside the sleek car caught her attention. At first she tried to look away, knowing guards disliked street children lingering too close. But a strange pull nudged her soul, a pull she could not name, one born from whispered memories of her own childhood, of hunger, of loss, of longing. She took a hesitant step forward. Through the tinted glass, she saw a small, motionless figure, his face round, his eyes dim, his body held stiffly in a wheelchair. Something inside her shifted painfully. She knew what despair looked like. She had lived beside it. But this was a deeper wound, a quieter kind of breaking. She gently approached the car, her breath softening as she leaned forward enough to truly see him. His eyes lifted as if waking from a long, haunted dream. And in that moment, Zuri felt her own heart stumble. Because the look he gave her wasn't empty. It was pleading, fragile, terrified, and desperately human. A look that begged for connection but had forgotten how to ask. The guard stiffened, stepping forward, but Zuri couldn't look away. For the first time in a long while, Tunda's gaze held another person. Not a therapist, not a guard, not his father, her. A homeless girl he had never seen before. Yet something unspoken passed between them in that suspended breath, a quiet thread of recognition woven between two wounded souls who didn't know they were about to change each other's destinies. And as the therapist returned and the guards moved in, Tunda's trembling gaze refused to leave Zuri's face, pulling her into a moment she couldn't escape, a moment that would soon shatter the walls between poverty and privilege, silence and hope, despair and unimaginable fate. Some moments arrive so quietly that a person almost walks past them, unaware that fate is holding its breath. And yet, in the middle of a noisy street where cars honked and people hurried by without seeing her, Zuri felt a strange pull guiding her toward a boy whose silence carried more weight than her hunger ever had. She did not know that a single hesitant step would begin unraveling a future neither she nor the world around her was prepared to witness. The morning sun had barely warmed the pavement when Zuri noticed the silver luxury car parked near the sidewalk ramp. She had passed by that same spot countless times, wiping windshields for spare coins, gathering discarded wrappers for scraps of food, and pretending not to hear the insults people threw so casually at children like her. But today, something felt different. A familiar heaviness settled in her chest the moment she saw movement through the half-open door of the car, movement that seemed too fragile, too uncertain, too lost. Tunda's caregiver had stepped away for a moment, answering a call that seemed to demand his complete attention. The man paced near the pharmacy gate, his voice rushed and frustrated, leaving the boy completely unattended. Zuri hesitated at first, fearing the guards who normally chased her away. Her fingers curled around the rag she used for cleaning car windows, and her feet remained rooted where she stood, torn between fear and instinct. But then she saw it. Tunda's wheelchair tilted slightly at the ramp, the wheels struggling against the uneven stone, his small hands gripping the armrests as though the slightest shift might send him sliding. Something inside her softened instantly. Zuri stepped forward slowly, each movement quiet, deliberate, as if she were approaching a wounded bird that might break if startled. She moved around the car, keeping her distance until she saw the uncertainty flicker across Tunda's face, an expression so painfully vulnerable it reached straight into the deepest memories of her own childhood. She took a breath that trembled more than she wanted, then crouched gently beside the wheelchair. "Do you want help?" she whispered, her voice so soft it felt like part of the breeze. Tunda did not speak. He couldn't, but his eyes widened, not in fear, but in something that looked very close to hope. His fingers twitched nervously, as though unsure how to respond after months of silence. Zuri placed her hand on the armrest, carefully adjusting the padded cushion that had slipped sideways. She moved slowly, mindful of his fragile limbs, her touch light and respectful. The wheelchair steadied, its wheels settling straight, and Tunda released a shaky breath she didn't realize he had been holding. In that single breath, something shifted between them. Zuri looked up, and their eyes met, really met, without barriers, without pity, without the noise of the world pressing in on them. Tunda's gaze, once empty and distant, now softened with a trust he hadn't shown anyone since the accident. It startled Zuri. She had never been looked at that way, not by adults, not by children, not even by people who offered her coins with distracted kindness. This boy, wrapped in wealth she could not imagine, looked at her as though she mattered, as though her presence had made something in his world easier to bear. For a moment, everything around them faded, the passing cars, the busy footsteps, the distant chatter. Time felt suspended, hanging delicately between a girl who had lost almost everything and a boy who had once had everything taken from him. Zuri lifted his armrest a little higher, smoothing the fabric so it supported his elbow comfortably. She wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead with the edge of her sleeve, and Tunda's eyes glistened with unspoken gratitude. She didn't realize the simple act of care had changed the air around them until she felt her pulse quicken. She tried to speak, to ask if he needed water or shade or anything that might bring comfort to the fragile quietness wrapped around him, but the words tangled in her throat. It felt too intimate, too important, too big to rush. So she simply steadied the wheelchair again, pressing her hand softly against the handle, as though anchoring him to the world he had retreated from. Tunda lifted his hand, slowly, weakly, until his fingertips brushed the edge of her wrist, a gesture so small it could have been missed, yet powerful enough to break something open inside her. She opened her mouth at last, ready to offer him the gentle reassurance his trembling eyes seemed to beg for. But before she could say even a single word, the air behind her shifted sharply. A deep, commanding voice sliced through the quiet moment, heavy with authority and suspicion. Zuri froze as the man behind her demanded to know exactly what she thought she was doing, pulling her into the kind of confrontation that would change everything that came next. Power often sees threat where there is none, especially when it speaks through the lips of fear. And in the next breath of fate, Zuri felt how brutally a single moment could shift, when a world built on wealth misjudged a girl who owned nothing but her sincerity. Mr. Kamau arrived like a storm breaking across calm water. His footsteps struck the pavement with urgency, his voice sharp and trembling with the instinctive protectiveness of a father whose child had suffered too much already. From a distance, all he had seen was a homeless girl, touching his paralyzed son's wheelchair, her thin frame bent beside the car, her hand near the armrest, her face close to the boy he guarded more fiercely than his entire empire. In that split second, fear overpowered logic. He rushed forward, calling Tunde's name with a strain that revealed how deeply terror had cut into him since the accident that stole his child's joy. Bodyguards appeared almost instantly, emerging from both sides like shadows trained to eliminate even imagined danger. Their posture stiffened, eyes narrowing at Zuri, hands hovering near the boy as though she were a threat. Zuri felt herself shrinking back instinctively, her heartbeat stumbling into panic. It wasn't their size that frightened her. It was the certainty in their expressions, the way they looked at her as if she had committed a crime simply by caring. For the first time in months, she felt the old ache of invisibility twisting into something sharper, the fear of being seen only through the lens of someone else's assumptions. Mr. Kamau moved faster than the guards, his expensive suit catching the light in quick flashes. His face held a turmoil Zuri could not decipher. Anger, fear, grief, all woven into one expression. "What are you doing to my son?" he demanded, the words trembling slightly, more from panic than rage. His voice carried authority sharp enough to silence everyone around them, and for a breathless moment, even the noise of traffic seemed to fade. Zuri stepped back immediately, her hands lifted slightly, palms open in a quiet gesture of peace. Her voice, when it came, was barely louder than a whisper. I wasn't hurting him, sir. He was stuck on the ramp. I only helped fix his armrest." Her words stumbled, fragile yet sincere, each one shaped by fear and dignity at once. She could feel her throat tighten under the weight of being misunderstood, of being judged before she could explain herself. But the billionaire was staring only at Tunde, not at her. His hands hovered near his son's shoulders, checking him as though expecting injury. The memory of the accident clung tightly to him, shaping his every breath with a father's terror. Zuri waited in silence, unsure if he even heard her explanation, unsure if truth mattered to a man whose world had been carved by money and fear. One of the guards stepped closer, signaling for Zuri to move even farther away. The gesture was meant to intimidate, but Zuri did not resist. She simply stepped back again, her body trembling, though her gaze remained gentle. "I didn't mean to scare him," she repeated softly. "I just saw he needed help." It was then, when her voice cracked with quiet sincerity, that Tunde reacted. He lifted his hand. It happened slowly, shakily, as though every muscle in his arm fought against invisible chains. The boy who had spent months trapped in silence, who had barely moved since the accident, now stretched his fragile fingers toward the girl everyone else saw as a threat. His eyes, previously dim with exhaustion, widened with an urgency that cut sharply through the tension. He wasn't reaching for his father. He wasn't reaching for a guard. He was reaching for her. Mr. Kamau froze. The guards froze. Even Zuri froze, her breath catching as if the world had suddenly forgotten how to turn. For a long, suspended moment, the billionaire stared at his son, not with panic this time, but with disbelief. He watched as Tunde strained toward Zuri, his hand trembling, his expression raw with longing. It was a gesture of trust, of recognition, of something deeper than words could express, something the therapists, doctors, and specialists had spent months trying to awaken, something that had not moved until she touched his world. Zuri instinctively stepped forward again, her hands still trembling, but now guided by the same instinct that had brought her near him in the first place. And as she moved, Tunde's hand lifted higher, as though her presence pulled strength from a hidden piece of him no one else had been able to reach. Mr. Kamau stared at them both, his breath shallow, his certainty cracking under the force of something he had not expected to see. Not today, not ever. And in that awe-struck moment, as Tunde's trembling fingers reached toward the girl he trusted, the billionaire realized something impossible was unfolding before his eyes, something he could neither explain nor ignore. Healing does not always arrive with medicine or miracles. Sometimes it comes quietly, carried in the warmth of a stranger's presence. And in that fragile moment beside the busy street, a paralyzed boy felt something awaken inside him. Something he had forgotten belonged to him. For a few heartbeats, the world seemed to hold its breath. Tunde's thin arm trembled in the air, reaching toward Zuri, with a desperate slowness that made every watching soul fall silent. It was not simply emotion, it was a cry pulled from the deepest part of him, a yearning for connection after months of silent isolation. Zuri felt her chest tighten as she watched the boy struggle to lift his hand, as though unseen chains held him down. And yet he reached, not for comfort, not for safety, but for her, the homeless girl the world never noticed. Mr. Kamau stared at his son with an expression that cracked sharply through his polished composure. His lips parted, his brows tightened, and his usually commanding presence softened into disbelief. It had been months since he had seen his son move voluntarily, months since the accident that robbed the boy of his mobility, his voice, his laughter, his entire childhood. Specialists had spoken in clinical tones about trauma, neurological shock, psychological withdrawal. They had explained why the boy refused to respond to anyone, why his hands stayed limp, his eyes distant, his world sealed shut. But now, without warning, without therapy, without preparation, Tunde was reaching for a girl whose life existed worlds away from theirs. Zuri approached slowly, her movements gentle and almost reverent. She lowered herself beside the wheelchair, the rough pavement scraping her knees, yet she did not flinch. Her eyes softened with a tenderness that wrapped around the boy like quiet light. "Hey, little one," she murmured, her voice warm and steady, carrying the softness she wished someone had once given her in her lowest moments. "You're okay. I'm right here." Tunde's breathing changed, no longer shallow and fearful, but fuller, almost shaky with emotion. His eyes, once clouded with emptiness, blinked as if adjusting to a brightness he hadn't seen in months. He opened his mouth slightly, the effort visible in the twitch of his jaw. It was not speech yet, only a faint, broken sound, raw and fragile, but it was something. More than anyone had heard from him in far too long. Mr. Kamau staggered a step closer, his hand flying instinctively to his chest. His eyes glistened, reflecting both awe and torment. He had paid doctors, therapists, healers, anyone who promised progress. None had stirred even a whisper from his son. Yet this homeless girl, barefoot, dust-covered, hungry, had somehow lit a spark inside the boy he had nearly given up hope on. The billionaire sank to one knee beside them, unable to stop his hands from shaking as he watched his child try to vocalize a single breath of connection. Zuri gently guided Tunde's trembling hand into her own, cradling it as though holding something too precious to risk breaking. The boy's fingers curled faintly around hers, and a tiny smile flickered across his lips. Small, weak, but real. She looked up at the billionaire then, her expression uncertain, almost apologetic, as if she feared she had crossed a line simply by being human. Mr. Kamau swallowed, his throat tightening with a mixture of astonishment and the kind of gratitude that frightened him. He had always believed money could fix anything, that wealth was a shield against suffering, but wealth had failed him here, leaving him helpless before a child he could not reach. And now this girl, who had nothing, had touched his son's heart with a simplicity he could neither buy nor understand. As Zuri spoke softly to Tunde, her thumb brushing gently over the back of his hand. Mr. Kamau studied her calm presence, her sincerity, the natural ease with which she comforted the boy. He noticed how Tunde's muscles relaxed, how his shoulders loosened, how his breathing deepened as she sat beside him. There was no fear in him now, no tension, no withdrawal, only trust. And that terrified the billionaire. Because if this girl, this stranger, held the key to his son's healing, then everything he believed about control, power, and protection was about to change. He cleared his throat quietly, but the sound shook. Zuri lifted her head, startled by the emotion in his eyes. For the first time, he did not look at her with suspicion or authority, but with desperation he could no longer hide. The weight of uncertainty pressed heavily between them, growing thicker with each passing second. He took a slow breath, steadying himself before speaking. And then, in a voice stripped of pride and trembling with hope, Mr. Kamau asked a question Zuri never imagined a man of his power would ask her, one that would alter the lives of all three of them forever. Some moments arrive so gently that you almost miss their power, yet they carry the weight to redirect a life. As Mr. Kamau looked at Zuri with desperation softening the steel in his eyes, she realized she was standing at the threshold of a door she never expected to be opened for someone like her. For a long moment, the world around them seemed suspended in a fragile stillness. Cars rolled past, engines humming softly. Pedestrians walked by without noticing the miracle unfolding on the sidewalk. And yet, everything felt muted beneath the intensity of the billionaire's gaze. Zuri felt painfully aware of her torn shirt, her dusty feet, the lingering smell of exhaustion she carried from nights spent under a broken bus shelter. She expected him to thank her, perhaps nod politely, then send her away with the same gentle dismissal the world always offered the poor. But instead, Mr. Kamau remained kneeling beside his son, his eyes fixed on her with a vulnerability that made her heart tighten. "Please," he said quietly, the word trembling with sincerity, "I need you to stay. Help him. You reached him in a way no one else has." Zuri blinked, her breath catching as though the air had thickened around her. She looked at Tunda, his small fingers still curled lightly around her hand, his expression soft, calmer than she had seen before. His eyes, once dimmed by months of silent suffering, now held a faint shimmer of awareness. She wanted to help him. Her heart had already leaned toward him the moment their gazes first met. But the request felt impossibly large. She pulled her hand back slowly, unsure whether she had the right to accept such a responsibility. I don't know if I can," she whispered, her voice barely steady. "I'm not trained. I have nothing. I'm just—" She hesitated, swallowing the word before it left her tongue. Just homeless, just forgotten, just someone the world overlooked. The thought pressed heavily against her ribs, but Mr. Kamau shook his head firmly, reading the doubt in her eyes. "You are the first person my son has responded to since the accident," he said, his tone filled with an aching mixture of hope and fear. "Therapists, doctors, specialists, none of them reached him. But he reached for you. He tried to speak. Do you understand how impossible that was until now?" Zuri lowered her gaze, struggling to absorb the truth of his words. She felt the rough pavement beneath her knees, the weight of uncertainty pressing against her chest, and yet beneath it all was a quiet spark, the same spark she'd felt the moment she touched Tunda's trembling hand. Perhaps it wasn't a skill the boy needed. Perhaps it was simply kindness, gentleness, presence, things Zuri had learned to hold on to even while life stripped everything else away. She lifted her head slowly. Tunda's eyes met hers again, full of fear and longing. "That was all it took, yeah," she murmured softly. "I'll stay. I don't know how much I can do, but I'll try. For him." Relief washed across Mr. Kamau's face so clearly that Zuri felt her own breath loosen. He nodded, almost gratefully, and gestured for her to sit beside Tunde again. The boy shifted slightly, as though anticipating her return. When she took his hand once more, he relaxed into the wheelchair, his shoulders easing with a trust he had not shown even to his father. They sat together in silence for a moment, Zuri carefully adjusting the footrest, brushing dust from the armrest, smoothing the folds of Tunde's shirt with the same tenderness she once used when caring for her younger siblings. Her presence seemed to settle something fragile inside him. His gaze followed her every movement, like he feared she might vanish if he blinked. Mr. Kamau watched them with a mixture of awe and confusion, as though witnessing a language spoken between hearts he himself could not translate. Zuri's voice was calm when she spoke to Tunde, her words simple, warm, steady. She encouraged him to breathe deeply, to relax his hands, to listen to her voice rather than the noise of the street. To her surprise, the boy responded, small twitches in his fingers, faint shifts in his breathing, tiny sparks of effort that no therapist had ever been able to coax out of him. Within minutes, a gentle rhythm formed between them, quiet, yet powerful. For the first time since the accident, Tunde looked less like a child trapped inside a broken body and more like a boy awakening from a long, sorrowful sleep. But just as Zuri reached out to guide his hand, encouraging him to lift it again, something unexpected happened. Tunde's entire body trembled with sudden determination, and before anyone could react, he attempted a movement so impossible, so astonishing, it left Zuri, Mr. Kamau, and the watching bodyguards frozen in absolute disbelief. Some moments unfold so quietly that the world almost misses their miracle, yet they carry the power to rewrite a life. And in that fragile instant, beneath the soft hum of city traffic and the trembling breath of a child rediscovering hope, something inside Tunde awakened with a force no doctor, no money, no medicine had ever managed to touch. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Zuri's hand hovered inches from the boy's, her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and fear of breaking the moment. Mr. Kamau stood rigid beside them, his lips parted as though he had forgotten how to breathe. Even the bodyguards, usually statues of unshakable discipline, leaned forward with shock flickering through their normally unreadable expressions. And in the center of it all sat Tunde, small, fragile, and trembling, with an effort that seemed to ripple through his entire body. Slowly, painfully, with a determination that pulled at every muscle in his face, Tunde lifted his fingers. Higher. Higher than he had since the day the accident stole control from his limbs. His small hand shook violently, but it rose. First a twitch, then a curl, then a trembling arch that defied every bleak diagnosis carved into his future. The moment felt sacred, like watching a flower push through cracked concrete, fragile yet unstoppable. "Tunde," Mr. Kamau whispered, his voice breaking in half, swallowed by emotion. His eyes glistened with tears he had refused to shed for months. He had seen specialists across continents, spent millions on treatments, pleaded with the universe for a sign of movement. And now, in the presence of a homeless girl wrapped in dust and kindness, his son's fingers lifted toward light, as if answering a long-forgotten call. Zuri didn't speak immediately. She didn't want to risk startling him. Instead, she leaned closer, her presence steady and warm, her breath calming, her eyes reflecting a hope she hadn't dared to believe she could offer someone else. "You're doing so well," she murmured softly, her voice a tender guide cutting through the noise of the world. "It's okay. You're safe. Keep going, little one." Tunde's eyes, once dulled by fear and pain, brightened with something she had never seen in him before. Not just recognition, not just trust, something deeper. A spark of life resurfacing after being buried beneath trauma and silence. His lips twitched, struggling against months of immobility. Zuri realized he was trying to speak, and she leaned even, closer, gently brushing his hand to encourage him. Then, in a voice thin as a thread, rough as a forgotten whisper, he breathed out a single word. "Stay." The sound was barely audible, yet it crashed over Mr. Kamau like a tidal wave. His knees buckled slightly, and he steadied himself on the wheelchair handle, one hand lifting to cover his trembling mouth. "Oh, my son," he whispered, tears rolling freely now, unrestrained, unhidden. "My boy, you spoke. After all these months, you spoke." Zuri's eyes widened, her heart pounding so loudly she swore it echoed in her ears. She took Tunde's hand gently, steadying it as he tried to lift it again. "I'm here," she assured him softly, her words wrapping around him like a blanket. "I'm not going anywhere." Encouraged by her presence, Tunde attempted another movement. His fingers twitched, then curled around hers with a delicate but intentional grasp. He shifted his wrist, his arm lifting a fraction more. Each motion was a battle, but he fought with a quiet fierceness that radiated through his trembling body. The small sounds he made, tiny breaths, soft groans of effort, echoed like music to his father's ears. Mr. Kamau crouched beside them, wiping his face with shaking hands. "Zuri, whatever you did, however you did it." He paused, unable to finish, overwhelmed by gratitude and disbelief. "This is more progress than we've seen in a year." But Zuri only shook her head softly. "I did nothing magical, sir. He just needed someone to feel safe with." She glanced at Tunde, her expression gentle. "Sometimes healing starts with one person who sees you." The billionaire's gaze lingered on her, searching, thinking deeply, almost desperately. Something shifted in him then, a decision forming quietly but firmly in the depth of his heart, reshaping itself around the miracle he had just witnessed. For the first time in a long time, hope did not feel like a fragile visitor, but a force returning home. As Tunde's eyelids fluttered with exhaustion, and Zuri continued whispering gentle encouragement beside him, Mr. Kamau stepped away for a moment, pulling out his phone. His expression hardened, not with anger, but with resolve. A decision was forming, one that stretched far beyond gratitude, far beyond the moment, far beyond anything Zuri could imagine. And later that night, after witnessing the impossible unfold before his eyes, Mr. Kamau made a choice so bold, so unexpected, that even his most trusted advisors would struggle to believe he was truly going to do it. The greatest blessings rarely arrive wrapped in comfort. They come disguised as responsibilities that feel too heavy for fragile shoulders, too grand for a wounded heart to carry. And as Zuri stepped across the threshold of a world she had never imagined entering, she felt the weight of a destiny she did not yet know she had been chosen for. From the moment Mr. Kamau made the offer, the world around Zuri shifted in ways she struggled to comprehend. Just hours before, she had been wiping dust from her feet under a broken bus shelter, surviving on hope that flickered more softly each day. Now she stood in the echoing halls of a mansion carved from marble and glass, a place where wealth did not whisper. It roared from every polished surface. The air smelled faintly of citrus and quiet luxury, but beneath its sweetness, Zuri felt the trembling awareness that she was trespassing in a life that did not belong to her. She expected the offer to be temporary, a moment of gratitude that would fade with sunrise. Yet Mr. Kamau's voice had carried a sincerity she could not ignore. "You helped my son in ways no one could. Let me help you." For the first time in years, she was shown to a room with a door that locked from the inside, not to trap her, but to protect her. The guest room was small compared to the rest of the mansion, yet to Zuri it felt impossibly vast. A soft bed covered with clean sheets stood beneath a window, where morning light filtered in, warm and gentle. She touched the pillow with hesitant fingers, tears gathering as she realized she would no longer sleep curled against cold concrete or rain-soaked cardboard. A folded blanket lay at the foot of the bed, and when she lifted it, she pressed it to her cheek like a treasure, overwhelmed by the unfamiliar softness. She stood there for a long moment, breathing deeply, letting the reality settle like a fragile dream she feared would vanish if she moved too quickly. Her new responsibilities began the next morning with the guidance of Tunde's physical therapist, who showed her basic exercises, gentle stretches, finger movements, posture support. Zuri paid attention with an intensity sharpened by gratitude, memorizing each instruction. But when the therapist stepped aside, it became clear that what Tunde responded to most was not technique or training. It was Zuri's presence. She had a way of speaking to him that softened the stiff edges of his fear. Her patience seemed endless, her tone soothing, her movements slow and reassuring. When she held his hand, he relaxed. When she encouraged him, he tried harder. And when she smiled, something inside him flickered back to life, as though she carried a warmth he had long forgotten. Days passed, each one bringing small victories that felt like miracles. A lifted wrist, a clearer word, a steady gaze that lingered longer each time. Tunde even laughed, softly at first, a sound that shocked the entire room into silence. Then the laughter grew, light and unrestrained, and for a moment Zuri felt her own heart lift in response, warmed by the knowledge that she had helped bring something sacred back into his life. She began waking each morning with purpose, stepping into her role with a quiet determination, carved from years of surviving without being seen. The emptiness that once consumed her slowly filled with meaning, and the ache of hunger that had shaped her life transformed into a hunger to help, to give, to heal. Even Mr. Kamau changed. He began spending more evenings at home, sitting quietly beside his son, watching the way Tunde's eyes followed Zuri with a trust that had been absent since the accident. Sometimes the billionaire would pause at the doorway, observing them with a mixture of awe and humility, as though trying to reconcile the immense wealth he commanded with the simple truth that healing had come from a place he never would have looked. He thanked Zuri often, not with grand speeches, but with small gestures, a warm meal placed before her, a new pair of shoes left at her door, a gentle reminder that she belonged under his roof as much as anyone else. But as Zuri settled deeper into her new life, whispers began circulating beyond the mansion walls. Word spread quickly in a city where wealth created shadows, and envy seeped through cracks like smoke. A homeless girl living inside a billionaire's house, caring for his heir, moving through halls meant for the powerful? It stirred questions, resentments, jealous curiosity, all carried by people who never cared about her when she slept on the streets. And soon those whispers twisted into something harsher, jealousy sharp enough to threaten the fragile peace Zuri had only just begun to trust, setting into motion a trouble she never saw coming. Whenever light begins to rise, shadows gather, quiet, patient, waiting for the perfect moment to swallow it whole. And as Zuri's gentle presence brought healing into the mansion, unseen eyes watched her with growing suspicion, their whispers curling through the halls like smoke searching for something to burn. In the days that followed Tunde's remarkable progress, the mansion shifted in ways Zuri did not immediately recognize. At first, she felt only the subtle changes, the sudden quiet when she entered a room, the way conversations faded into uneasy silence, the glances that slid across her like thin blades. The staff, once polite in a distant way, began observing her with new intensity. Some looked confused, others wary, and a few carried an unsettling flicker of resentment, as though her very existence had disturbed a long-standing order they believed was theirs to protect. Zuri felt the tension first in the kitchen. She walked in one morning to prepare porridge for Tunde, and the room, usually humming with low chatter, fell silent. One of the maids paused mid-task, her hand hovering above a pot, while another leaned close to whisper something behind a raised hand. Zuri pretended not to notice, her movement steady, her expression calm, though her heart tightened with a familiar ache, the silent rejection she had known all her life. She stirred the porridge gently, focusing on the soft rhythm of the spoon, choosing humility over confrontation. Even so, she could feel their gazes tracing her every move, searching for something to confirm their doubts. By afternoon, the whispers had grown bolder. Rumors drifted through corridors like dust in sunlight. Some claimed Zuri had bewitched the billionaire's son. Others suggested she was manipulating Mr. Kamau with calculated softness. A few even murmured that she was seeking wealth, acting out a role she had rehearsed on the streets. The stories twisted in ways cruel enough to sting, yet none of them shocked Zuri. People feared what they didn't understand, and kindness offered freely was something many had forgotten how to trust. She refused to defend herself. She had lived her whole life without explanations, without a voice loud enough to override judgment. Instead, she poured her strength into caring for Tunde, soothing his fears, guiding his movements, and speaking to him with the patience that had become her quiet armor. Each day he grew more responsive, lifting his hands longer, forming soft words with effort, even smiling more openly. And each time he reached for her, the whispers behind closed doors sharpened with a bitterness that scratched at the edges of the household. Mr. Kamau noticed the shift as well. Though he said nothing at first, he observed the strange stiffness among his staff, the dropped gazes, the unnecessarily formal greetings, the slight tension that settled whenever Zuri walked past. He sensed the unease swirling beneath the surface, stirring like a storm, tightening its grip, yet he could not pinpoint its source. But he did notice one thing with unmistakable clarity. Zuri's grace never faltered. She moved through doubt with the same soft dignity she had carried through hunger and hardship. He found himself admiring not just her impact on his son, but the steadiness of her character. Still, the rumors continued to spread, gathering strength, gaining shape, carried by those who feared losing favor or status. And among them was someone whose envy simmered just beneath the mask of professionalism, someone who believed Zuri's presence threatened everything they had built their reputation upon. This person watched Zuri with tightened eyes, studied the billionaire's reactions, analyzed every moment she spent helping Tunde. Their jealousy grew quietly, fueled by insecurity and the belief that the homeless girl had stepped into a place she did not deserve. Zuri, unaware of the storm gathering behind her, focused her heart solely on Tunde. Each time he whispered her name, each time his fingers reached for hers, she felt purpose blooming within her, a purpose she had chased unknowingly through every hardship life had forced upon her. But she could not see the shadow rising behind her, nor the plans quietly being laid by someone determined to tear her away from the place where she had finally begun to belong. And one evening, as the sun dipped low and the mansion settled into its quiet ritual of dusk, that hidden resentment found its moment, an action taken in silence, calculated and deliberate, threatening to shatter Zuri's fragile new life with a single, devastating blow. In moments of injustice, truth becomes the sharpest light, cutting through lies with a quiet precision that exposes every shadow. And on this day, when Zuri's dignity stood on the edge of collapse, that light prepared to reveal more than anyone expected. The tension began with a whisper, soft, calculated, and poisonous enough to linger in the hallways long before Zuri even sensed it. A staff member, driven by jealousy and wounded pride, stepped forward with a trembling voice and an accusation sharp enough to slice through the fragile peace of the household. They claimed that money had gone missing from the storage room, and that Zuri, the homeless girl taken in by the billionaire, had been seen near the area shortly before it disappeared. The word spread quickly, like a web tightening around someone who had never learned to defend herself. Zuri froze when the accusation reached her. She felt the familiar heaviness settle over her shoulders, the weight of being misjudged, the sting of being seen as less simply because she came from nothing. Her hands trembled, not out of guilt, but out of the quiet fear that truth was often too delicate to stand against loud lies. She looked at Mr. Kamau with wide, steady eyes, her voice soft yet unwavering, as she simply whispered, "I didn't take anything." She did not defend herself with anger or desperation. She stood the way only someone who had survived the hardest parts of life could. Calm, quiet, dignified. A hush spread through the mansion as every gaze shifted toward Mr. Kamau. He did not raise his voice. He did not allow the accusation to harden his expression. Instead, he did something no one expected from a man of his power. He remained completely still. His silence was meticulous, controlled, the kind that made people shift nervously under the weight of their own assumptions. Then, with a tone so steady it almost felt like a warning, he said, "Bring me the security footage." His decision shocked everyone. Most had assumed he'd order Zuri out immediately, that he would react with the swiftness of a man trying to protect his household. But Mr. Kamau had seen too much in Zuri's eyes, too much sincerity, too much heart, to believe a rumor built on jealousy. The staff exchanged uneasy glances as he followed the head of security into the surveillance room, the atmosphere vibrating with anticipation. Minutes later, he emerged with a tablet in hand. No one breathed as he pressed play. On the screen, Zuri could be seen walking down the corridor near the storage room. But instead of stealing, she was helping an older maid pick up fallen towels, stacking them neatly before continuing on her way. The footage continued, revealing the real thief slipping into the storage room moments later, the very employee who had accused her. Their face turned pale as the truth unfolded before everyone's eyes, the room tightening around them, like a closing fist. Gasps spread through the household. The staff member stuttered excuses, but their voice dissolved under the weight of their exposed deception. Mr. Kamau's expression remained unreadable as he turned to Zuri, his voice carrying a depth that made even the walls seem to lean in. "Zuri," he said slowly, "I owe you an apology." The room fell silent, not because of the apology itself, but because of the sincerity behind it. Billionaires did not apologize. Men of power rarely bowed to truth when pride stood in the way. Yet here he was, lowering his voice, softening his posture, looking at Zuri with a respect she had never received from anyone except her parents. Zuri shook her head gently, her eyes glistening. "You didn't accuse me," she whispered. "You listened." That alone meant more to her than any defense could. The staff watched in stunned silence, many ashamed, some humbled, a few quietly remorseful. But none were prepared for what came next. An announcement that struck the mansion like a quiet earthquake. Mr. Kamau stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across the staff before returning to Zuri with unshakable resolve. "From this day onward," he said, his voice carrying the weight of finality, "Zuri will have a place in this home that none of you can question." And the next words he spoke left every person in the room absolutely speechless. Some opportunities do not simply appear. They are shaped by the rare people who finally recognize the quiet brilliance you carried, even when the world refused to see it. And on this day, Zuri stood on the edge of a destiny she never imagined could belong to her. The mansion was still wrapped in a stunned silence after the truth had unfolded, but inside Mr. Kamau's private study, a different kind of stillness took shape. Warm, deliberate, almost reverent. Zuri sat across from the billionaire, her back straight yet trembling with the weight of the moment. She had been called there immediately after the household gathered, her heart pounding with uncertainty. She didn't know whether she was being thanked, reassured, or dismissed quietly with a polite gesture. Years of hardship had taught her that kindness often came with conditions, and generosity could shift without warning. But Mr. Kamau's face held none of the stern formality he usually carried. Instead, there was something deeper, an expression softened by gratitude, shaped by awe, and warmed by a kind of hope he hadn't felt in years. He took a breath, folding his hands on the table before him, his voice steady but filled with emotion he didn't try to hide. "Zuri," he began, "these past days I've watched something extraordinary. My son, my Tunda, responded to you in ways no therapist, no specialist, no highly trained expert ever could. You reached him not with technique, but with something far rarer, with heart." He paused, letting his words settle. "And I have spent, too many, years believing money could fix everything, forgetting that some wounds need more than wealth." Zuri lowered her gaze, unsure where such words were leading, her fingers intertwined nervously, her heartbeat quickening. She had never been praised in this way, never been acknowledged for anything beyond the simple tasks she fought to survive through. The idea that a man of immense power saw value in her, it felt unreal, overwhelming, almost frightening. Mr. Kamau leaned forward slightly. "I cannot change your past," he said quietly. "I cannot erase the hunger you endured, or the nights you slept in the cold, or the pain the world pressed upon you. But I can help shape your future." His voice softened further. "If you will let me." Zuri's breath caught, her heart pressing against her ribs. She lifted her eyes slowly, searching his expression for some hint of what he meant. He reached into a folder beside him and placed a set of documents gently on the table, papers with school emblems, schedules, and acceptance forms. "I want to sponsor your education," he said. "Fully, completely. From today until the day you graduate. Whatever you choose to study, wherever you choose to grow, you deserve more than survival. You deserve a life, a career, a future you build with pride." The words hit her with the force of a miracle she had never dared pray for. Her throat tightened, and tears pooled in her eyes faster than she could stop them. She had imagined 1,000 possible paths ahead, most bleak, many uncertain, but never this, never something so dignifying, so affirming, so rare. She shook her head weakly. "Sir, I don't know if I—" "You are worthy of this," he said firmly, cutting through her doubt with gentle certainty. "You proved that the day you helped my son, without expecting anything in return." The door opened softly, then, and Tunda's wheelchair eased into the room. His face, the quiet face of a boy who had forgotten joy, now held a faint glow of anticipation. He moved his hand, slowly, deliberately, a movement hard-earned and deeply emotional. His eyes, full of childlike sincerity, lifted to Zuri as he whispered, "Stay." The single word broke the last of Zuri's composure. She pressed a hand over her mouth as tears escaped freely. Tunde rolled closer, taking her trembling fingers in his, as though his tiny grip was the anchor holding her trembling heart steady. Mr. Kamau's voice softened as he watched the bond between them. "My son needs you," he said quietly. "Not as a servant, not as a helper, as part of our family." The word family echoed through her like a prayer answered in the gentlest whisper. For years she had walked alone, craving a place to belong. And now the people who saw her heart, not her poverty, were inviting her into theirs. She nodded slowly, her voice fragile with emotion. "I accept," she whispered. "Thank you. Truly." Tunde smiled, an expression, small but miraculous, one the staff hadn't seen since long before the accident. He lifted his hand again, trembling but determined, and placed it gently over his chest before reaching toward her. And in that tender gesture, simple, pure, filled with unspoken gratitude, Tunde offered her something no one expected, a sign of trust so profound It would become the final blessing that sealed Zuri's place in their lives forever. Sometimes the most broken hearts are the ones chosen to heal others, mending wounds not with medicine, but with presence, tenderness, and sincerity. In ways no one saw coming, Zuri's quiet compassion was about to rewrite a billionaire's family into something whole again. The sun poured through the wide windows of the Kamau estate, like a gentle blessing, filling the rehab room with soft, golden light. Zuri stood beside Tunde, as she had done every morning since she accepted her place in their home, steadying his arm, encouraging his small movements, whispering patiently through each slow breath he took. The boy who once refused to speak, who hid behind silence and sorrow, now looked at her with hope shimmering in his eyes. Today felt different. There was a tension in the air, not the heavy kind that comes with fear, but the delicate anticipation that something extraordinary was waiting to unfold. Zuri adjusted the ankle brace the physiotherapist had shown her how to use, smoothing the straps with careful hands. Tunde watched her intently, his fingers curling around hers as if gathering courage from her touch. "Are you ready?" Zuri asked softly. He didn't speak. He simply nodded. With Zuri on one side and the assistant therapist on the other, Tunde shifted forward. His arms trembled, his breath quickened, his legs felt like fragile branches. But then, with a quiet determination that tightened every heart in the room, he pushed upwards. His body wavered, his knees shook, his arms strained, and slowly, almost painfully slowly, Tunde stood. The room froze. For a moment no one dared breathe, afraid the smallest sound might shatter the miracle forming right before them. Zuri covered her mouth, tears rising uncontrollably as she whispered his name in disbelief. The therapist stared, eyes wide and glassy. Even the household staff watching from the hallway pressed their hands to their chest in stunned silence. But it was Tunde's next action that unraveled every heart. He turned, weakly, unsteadily, yet with purpose, and leaned toward Zuri. She instinctively stepped forward to steady him, but instead of gripping her arm for balance, he wrapped his tiny, trembling arms around her waist. His cheek pressed against her stomach. His voice, thin but clear, broke through the air. "Sister." The word struck like a beam of light, pure, innocent, overflowing with emotion. It was the first time he had named someone with that kind of bonding affection since before the accident. Zuri's knees nearly buckled under the force of it. She lowered herself slowly, embracing him tightly, her tears falling into his hair as she whispered, "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." The door at the far end opened, and Mr. Kamau stepped in, only to freeze mid-stride. His eyes widened as he took in the scene, his son standing for the first time in months, his hands anchored around the girl who once slept beneath a broken bus shelter. Tunde looked up and reached toward him, and the billionaire, once a man defined by power, wealth, and loss, fell to his knees beside his child, overwhelmed. He kissed Tunde's forehead, then placed a trembling hand on Zuri's shoulder. You brought him back to me," he whispered, voice cracking. "You brought our family back." Zuri shook her head gently. "He healed because he wanted to live again. I only stood with him." Mr. Kamau looked at her with the solemn intensity of a man speaking truth carved from the deepest gratitude. "No, Zuri. You gave him something none of us could, hope." That evening, the entire household gathered in the grand living room. Mr. Kamau stood at the center, his hand resting proudly on Tunde's wheelchair. Zuri stood beside them, nervous but composed. When everyone fell silent, he addressed the room. "This young woman," he said, gesturing toward Zuri, "is no longer a guest, no longer an employee, no longer someone passing through our lives." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. From this day forward, she is family. Soft gasps rippled through the room. Some staff covered their mouths. Others wiped tears away. Tunda beamed, gripping Zuri's hand as though claiming her with all the strength he possessed. The following weeks unfolded like a new chapter, written with grace. Zuri enrolled in school for the first time in years, walking through the gates in a crisp uniform provided by the Kamau family. She studied after dinner in the quiet library, while Tunde sat beside her, practicing small hand movements as she read aloud. Her world expanded with books, lessons, mentors, and dreams she had buried long ago beneath cardboard and cold streets. The Kamau household changed too. Laughter returned. Rooms once quiet now echoed with Tunde's voice. Even the staff, once skeptical, sought Zuri's advice, praised her progress, and treated her with genuine respect. A family once fractured by tragedy now stood whole, stitched together not by wealth, but by kindness from a girl the world had forgotten. And beyond the estate walls, whispers began to spread. Whispers of a homeless girl who had become the light that healed a billionaire's family. The world watched with awe, unaware that Zuri's journey was only just beginning. If Zuri's journey touched your heart even a little, don't let her message stop here. Click like to support more powerful, life-changing stories and share it with someone who needs hope today. Tell me in the comments which moment moved you the most. I read every word myself. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next emotional story is already on its way, and you won't want to miss it.